Hi, this is Vince House. Welcome to the Aereco podcast. Welcome to this week's podcast where we talk about retrofit at scale. I have the great pleasure of having three guests with me this week, all industry experts. We have Alex Honey, who has been involved in Passive House, in retrofit of Passive House for a number of years now. Is a coordinator and has deep understanding of how to achieve retrofit of existing stock. Next, we have Danielle Belton, who is the MD from Saving Energy. Saving Energy is a company that's been delivering retrofit works for over 15 years now, and have been working to the past 2030 standards that are required by a contractor. And last but by no means least, Dr. Peter Rickaby joins us. And if you don't know Peter, he has a wealth of knowledge in terms of energy efficiency, and is known for, amongst other things, being the author of PAS 2035. And it's absolutely fascinating to hear the views where we talk about retrofit at scale. We touch on SHDF quite a lot, and I hope you find this podcast as interesting as I had it. In fact, it was so big that we had to split it into two separate podcasts. So this week we'll be doing part one, and please join me for part two, which we hope to have out in the following week. Okay, here we go. Yeah, so I suppose when I spoke with you, Peter, I think one of the things when we were thinking about subjects that might be quite interesting, one that you said was switching you on at the moment was retrofit at scale, and I immediately thought of the work that's been carried out by Saving Energy down at in Kent for Clarion, and also Alex's involvement in that as well. So I guess it'd be interesting to hear your view on retrofit at scale initially, and where's it going?
Well, I think the driver at the moment is the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, Wave 2, because phase has big aspirations for the number involved. It's going to be wave after wave and much bigger than wave 1 and the demonstrator. So there's a lot of incentive for housing organisations to get in. The focus obviously is still on social housing. So I think that's certainly what I've been doing with my colleagues at Savills is trying to understand all the things in good retrofit and past 2035 compliant retrofit that we've been stumbling over during wave 1 and the demonstrator. And they're essentially things that are not the way people used to do things. So what we've been doing is trying to align our clients and Savills' own processes to doing things at scale, but also adapting processes to make everything lean and mean. Because if you're going to do hundreds of houses, so one of the first things we discovered, for example, is that most housing organizations divide their stock into types, and for their investment planning and their asset management plans and so on, with a stride of 30 years and looking to zero carbon, they've tended to make plans for types. But actually the types are too coarse for past 2035 compliant retrofit, because a type that's got a population of, say, 600 houses is going to have so much variation within it that you're going to end up doing different things. So one of the first lessons we learned was to focus on subtypes, but the division of a type into subtypes is driven by the measures you can apply. So, for example, you might have a type with 600 dwellings in it, and you think you're going to put external wall insulation on the whole thing, but actually probably 30 or 40% of them can't can't accept EWI, at least on the front, because they're in a conservation area, or they're listed, or there's too much architecture, or the front walls on the back of the pavement, or there's narrow alleyways, or whatever. So you end up saying, okay, that's a subtype that we can't do EWI on, and you keep working like that. And we've got actually 12 reasons why you can't do EWI. And then once you've found the ones you can't put EWI on, either completely or partially, then you start thinking about IWI or hybrids. And then you start thinking about what can we do to meet the SHDF space heating demand target of 90 kilowatt hours per square meter per year, if we can't put insulation on at least some of the walls. And so you end up thinking about, well, how much PV can I get on the roof? And the PV won't reduce the space heating demand, but it will compensate for the extra fuel costs to the tenants associated with less insulation. So we've been looking at that, and so it goes on. So it seems to me that what working at scale has been doing is enriching our processes and our approach to doing retrofit, all the while with past 2035 compliance in mind.
I think one of the things that I've sort of noticed being involved with obviously one of the larger housing associations, and Peter, perhaps it's correct or incorrect to make a generalisation based on the experience of one or two, is that they sort of have retrofit in a separate box from maintenance or other things, as though it's a discrete item on their list of jobs to do two houses over the next 30 years, and they don't really see it as integral. So from our experience, there was, if I recall distinctly, they got this thing about, oh, you know, every year we'll sign an order and we'll get 1,000 roofs redone, but they don't kind of sort of stop before they write that order and say, well, actually, why don't we take that opportunity to do a load of thermal improvement works as part of that roof renewal works? There seems to be a real disconnect right at the very top of the tree in terms of the various pots that they kind of allocate their capital to, and that I found really mysterious. And I think I felt like there was an element of education to get them to think about retrofit isn't a standalone bespoke item. It should just be what you do when you come and do something else to a house. And I felt that it wasn't something that they kind of really got, I don't think, from my personal experience.
I agree with you, and actually we've been, sorry Daniel, we've been coming from a slightly different direction though, which is that because Savills has forever been doing asset valuation, stock condition surveys, valuations, and helping people build their asset management and investment plans, that's where we've been starting from. And of course, when you start to do retrofit, as I'm sure you've discovered, you run up against things like, well, you can't do the IWI now because we're not going to change the kitchens and bathrooms for 4 years or for 24 years, and things like that. So what we've been trying to do is to say to them, really the same message you've just given us, Alex, which is you have to integrate retrofit with your investment plan over the next 30 years. And actually, when you do the analysis on its own for the stock and come up with the cost of retrofitting to say net zero by 2050, you come up with an eye-watering number, a cost. But then when you look at what they would have done anyway in those 30 years with windows and roofs and heating systems and so on, quite a lot of it comes out because it's already there in the budget. And so I think the real challenge is to say to housing organizations, look, you're not going to insulate these now because you can only insulate them internally, and therefore you have to wait until either it becomes a void or, more likely, until you replace the kitchen and the bathroom. And there are things like that. When you're going to do things in or on the roof is when you do the roof, and so on. So it's the whole thing about taking retrofit out of that stand on its own box and integrating it with the way we manage the stock. And I think you're right. Most housing organizations are just groping towards that, should we say? But that would seem to me to be the key issue. And of course, it isn't very well accommodated by government programs, which expect you to list all the things you're going to do in 2 years and deliver them all in 2 years. So what we've been trying to do is change that a little bit, without much success with bays, but also try to get housing organizations to not go for everything, not be seduced by the sexy technology, but just do demand reduction for the first phases.
Yeah.
So, let's just get the insulation, let's just get the demand down, and then we can start thinking about heat pumps when somebody's stabilized the heat pump market a bit better, and so on. So that's kind of been our approach, but I think you're absolutely right. The other thing I've been trying to fight against is the reaction that, oh, we'll do a pilot or we'll do a demonstrator. And my reaction to that has been, actually, the time for pilots and demonstrators is long gone. We've been doing pilots and demonstrators for 25, 30 years. We know how to do it. Retrofit for the Future taught us that, amongst other things, and Core and GLA Renew. And it's time to just roll our sleeves up, get our heads down and do it. And no more demonstrators. And that's not a very popular message, actually, because asset management managers are a bit risk averse and like to try things carefully before they. But actually, that's because their individual experience in their housing organisation may not be great, but across the sector, there's plenty of experience. They just need to get their heads together.
Yeah.
Danielle, we better let you in.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with what's being said. I spend an awful lot of my time educating clients on how these schemes work, what the different elements mean. As you touched upon earlier, Peter, you've got solar that increases the EPC and brings down energy usage, but it has absolutely no impact on the SHDF target. We've got PAS compliant elements of the work that have no impact on the EPC rating. So it's educating people that different things are required for different parts of this process. A lot of our housing associations are driven by cost, so they want things to be done as cheaply as possible. But in order to tick all three boxes of hitting the EPC target that they set internally, the SHDF for the funding, and then obviously the PAS requirements, there's an awful lot of cost that has to be put there to get the required end product. And also, my ethos has always been, you pay cheap, you pay twice. There is no point doing something cheaply now, because you end up having to repay for it a few years down the line. And on to Alex's point, this is something I have been banging on about for years and years. We will go in and externally insulate a property to find out 3 years later the windows are going to be changed. It's absolutely infuriating, and it's getting those different public sector departments to speak to each other and plan together for these works, because the amount of scaffold up, scaffold down, mediation works, and I've been in the industry for 20 years, and we've been saying this for 20 years, and I'm sure many people were saying it before we were, that there's got to be a more joined up approach. We've got to work more logically, more systematically, and stop having these constant return visits. We've got councils now planning to do their roofs, but they want EWI done in a couple of years' time. Well, the roof lines are going to need to be extended, so they need to redo their roofs with the extended roof lines now in preparation for that external wall insulation, if they can't do the both works together. How do we educate that en masse? I don't know. The turnover within councils and housing associations within the staff always seems to be high. So you get to a point where the team fully understand, and then they move on. And another council benefit from that learning, but you're then teaching someone else from scratch. And we have seen this over and over again. And as an installer, my job really should just be turning up on site and insulating the houses, or putting solar on the roof or changing the heating. But actually, I spend just as much time at the front end going through those processes of why they might want certain products, when the best time to have them is, and looking at stock for the next 3, 5, 10 years, and trying to get them to design their processes in a much more systematic way. I don't think there's a short answer to how we achieve that, because there's so many different cogs in social housing wheels.
Yeah, I mean, just being perhaps deliberately provocative, do we encourage the return of the DLO type of setup within some of these housing associations, such that they do keep some skill in-house? Because I would completely agree with Danielle, as from our experience, there hasn't been a lot of in-house expertise generally, and so you are forever sort of teaching, and it's just almost a mission impossible. So would it be easier if there was, I mean, back in the day there would have been the city architect, and there would have been a whole department in house, and that seems to have been lost, and therefore that continuity of information has been lost. And I'm not sure what the answer is, but we certainly need to. We seem to be wasting as a nation an awful lot of money and time, and that's not a good thing. We haven't got either, and that's what's so disappointing.
No, I mean, I think that's absolutely right, and we've certainly encountered that where, right when you go right through to past 2035 compliance, we find that with no technical expertise in house, a lot of housing organisations just want to bundle everything up into a design and build contract to someone on their framework, and out it goes, and they're effectively giving control to people who may not know any more about it than they do, but they're letting them loose on their own assets. And so what we've been trying to do is, through both the SHDF and the LADS program, is persuade housing organisations to keep at least the retrofit coordinator on their side of the contractual fence. And to a large degree, we've won that battle. Well, to some extent, not in every case. And we also think there are some advantages in having the retrofit designer on the client side of the fence and the retrofit assessor, because actually the retrofit assessor is collecting data that the housing organisation ought to be using in its forward planning and putting into its housing stock database. So, but trying to get those roles back onto the, not necessarily into the housing organisation, but on their side of the contractual fence is quite challenging, because it's procurement directors, I find, have been the most difficult people to persuade that they have to do retrofit that's past 2035 compliant and at scale differently from the way they've been procuring things for the last few years. And their procurement practice has actually been developed out of decent homes. And that's been all about delivering kitchens and bathrooms. And so doing something more complex and different means doing the procurement differently. But that's a hard message to get over, actually.
Yeah,
very hard message.
Do you think a lot of the procurement directors or asset directors understand what's involved? If they get a winning bid on the SHDF, I mean, it's great, isn't it? Because there's a pot of money there that goes into the stock. But do you think there's a little bit of I don't know, not a complete understanding of what's involved in that journey ahead? Because I heard I heard some money's gone back into the pot from
not very much,
where they've
not very much, but I think the demonstrator and wave one were meant to support that learning, and a lot of housing organizations came to it in, well, we're going to do this the way we do everything, and it didn't work, and they stumbled over all sorts of stuff. And I think they're a lot more focused now on what past 2035 compliance needs in order to make it work. What I have what we have done through some work that not only Savills but one or two other consultants did when we went to see BEIS, we went to see them with STBA and people like that to talk about SHDF, was that we made the point that there's no good having a program that you bid into and you know completely what you're going to do and you can price it. So we're going to do this, this and this to those houses and it's going to cost this much. That's our bid. When actually what past 2035 says you've got to do is do an assessment, do an improvement option evaluation and make a plan for each house type. And you don't know until you've done the improvement option evaluation what you're going to do. So then you're in this embarrassing position of saying to BEIS, oh, well, we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to do this instead. And so we went to BEIS and said we need a two-stage program so people can bid in to get their assessments and IOEs done and make their plans, and then they can bid in again to get the money to do the delivery. And BEIS said that they completely understand that. However, neither their bosses nor the Treasury will allow them to run the programs that way. So that was kind of end of argument. What they have now said, which I think is a huge step forward actually, is that from the announcement of the competition, which is going to be any time now, any preliminary work that's done, so for instance, doing assessments, doing improvement option evaluations, making plans to support bids, if the bid is successful, can be back charged into the grant. So it means that people who are doing work, who do work to support their bid at risk, if their bid is successful, will get the costs of doing the assessments, etc., the past 2035 compliance stuff back. It's only at risk in as much as they might not get their SHDF money, On the other hand, as it's has been pointed out to me by several people, they've got to do those assessments anyway. Every single house in everybody's stock is going to have an assessment, so they might as well get on with it and hope that they get some of the money back. So I think that's progress, and probably more. Excuse me, probably more than we hoped we would make, but it will certainly mean that we can do scale past 2035 compliant retrofit more easily if people are reasonably confident that they've got to do it the first stuff, the assessments anyway, and then there's a good chance they'll get their costs for doing that.
Just out of curiosity, Peter, because you obviously fly around in much higher levels than some of the rest of us, what's the government's appetite for retrofitting social housing in the UK? I mean, is there a real appetite, or is it we'll find some technological thing in 20 years' time and it'll all go away and we won't worry about it?
Well, I think it depends where you're looking. In the civil service, they are completely, I think, aware of the issues and the problems and the technicalities and signed up to it, and they've been building programs like SHDF, LADS and HUG and so on, and Eco4 to deliver. The only focus they're allowed by the politicians is on the fuel poor, although it looks to me as though within a few months that's going to be all of us. That's right. So the politicians are so if you take the civil servants, I know, for example, there are civil servants in Bays working on policies for the next government, not for this government. They've given up on this government.
Well, I think we all have.
Yeah, and what's happening at the political level is that domestic retrofit is toxic politically.
Yes,
certainly in the Conservative Party. They've had failures with the Green Deal, Green Homes Voucher Scheme, and so on, and the conservatory tax thing from the Daily Mail on the consequential improvements, and they keep getting into big political trouble locally. So if Tory backbenchers are saying to the government, retrofit is toxic, don't go there. There is no will in the Conservative Party to tell people what to do to their homes, and that's kind of consistent with their ideology anyway. What they're prepared to do is to put money into alleviating fuel poverty. So that's why what we've got is pretty much all focused on stuff that's lower than EPCC, worse than EPCC, fuel poor households, and those kinds of things. However, what we do know is that, I mean, the technical fix is to generate lots of zero carbon electricity with offshore wind or other equivalent renewables, and then use that to supply heat pumps. But if you do the numbers, as my UCL colleagues have done for Bays, what you discover is if you electrified all the heat in the UK building stock and the hot water, you'd need 30 times as much offshore wind or other renewable equivalents to supply it as we've got now. It's taken us 30 years to build the offshore wind we've got now, and we need 30 times as much in the next 28 years. So that doesn't work. So then you say, well, actually, we would do it mostly with heat pumps. So that brings that factor of 30 down to 12. So we still need 12 times as much offshore wind as we've got now in the next 28 years. So that's like doubling our offshore wind capacity every 2 years. So that doesn't really work either. And then the next step is, well, actually, if we do retrofit and we reduce demand by 60%, we can do it with 4 times as much offshore wind. And what did you discover? That in the heat and building strategy, it says we're going to quadruple the offshore wind capacity by 2050. So they've kind of got that. They've made that connection, and then they made it 8 times because they've realised they also have to put some more capacity in for electric vehicles. And then there's another issue, which is the local electricity network distribution capacity. You may have enough wind turbines in the North Sea to supply the power, but you've got to get it to people's houses, and we probably need to double that. And at the moment, the distribution network operators are, I think, a bit complacent. They think, yeah, we can do that. We can double the network capacity, but people will have to pay. And, if you're a big house builder building an estate or a housing organisation retrofitting an estate, that may be possible. But for your average Mrs. Smith in her house, she's not going to pay to have the cables reinforced. So there's a bit of a capacity issue there too. So all that stuff is going together. But what it taught me was that you have to do demand reduction. It's not zero carbon supply or demand reduction. It's both. and we have to do on average 60%. So that then poses the question to the politicians: well, how are we going to get 60% out of the 67% of the housing stock which is owner occupied? And that, I think, there is no answer to at the moment. Well, no political answer to.
Well, I guess the answer is simply by making sure that gas and electricity are so expensive that people actually go and vote with their feet and do things, which is exactly what's happening.
Yes, exactly right. Exactly right. But they seem to think that the way to alleviate that is not to insulate people's homes, but to do lots of fiscal stuff to try and kind of buy people out of trouble. And that doesn't really work in the longer term. I mean, I've been getting very cynical in the last 6 months because of the apparent lack of ability of politicians to even understand, let alone engage with this stuff. And I'm beginning to think that, Insulate Britain and Don't Pay movements are both probably where we have to be. We have to go and support those guys. It's only going to be by direct action and civil disobedience that we're going to get this to happen. So I think we have to give them a lot more grief up to the next election.
I would completely agree with that. However, I think we also need to look at, as an industry, a construction industry that is, how do we also engage with the public such that actually graduates and others actually want to join, so that we've actually got a pool of people that actually want to go and do the works. Because, as Danielle will attest, trying to find local people that actually want to get involved with improving their local housing stock, they're like hen's teeth. So yes. I think there's a huge, I mean, I always joked about the Insulate sort of Britain people, actually, instead of sticking themselves to the road, it'd be much more useful if they stuck some insulation to the walls.
Yes, absolutely.
But how do we do that? I mean, that's the starting point, isn't it? Is to try and make it a sexy thing to do. I want to go into construction to retrofit 20 million homes because they're all rubbish.
Well, we've sort of started to get there with the professionals. We've got Letty, and we've got Architects CAN, so the Climate Action Network. So after 25 years of being complacent, the building industry professions have finally signed up to the climate emergency and need to do something. I think that the problem is that your average guy is coming out of school or college and wants to find a career, doesn't look to retrofit, because actually we're setting up structures that don't have much progression in them. If you become a retrofit coordinator, what's the next stage in your career? If you become a retrofit assessor, are you going to spend 40 years just assessing dwelling? If you become an installer of insulation, is there a progression process? Can you get to be a supervisor or a manager or whatever? And what we haven't got really is the infrastructure that makes the industry as attractive as it could be.
So, go on, Danielle.
This skills shortage is a big problem, though, because even forget the professional side, but the boots on the ground part at the moment, there's wave one schemes, many of them, that haven't put a spade in the ground yet because they do not have a set of procured staff or people to deliver it. We are being contacted day in, day out to say, can you do another 50 EWIs before March? Can you take on another site of 100 properties? There's only so much we can do before our quality suffers because we're spreading ourselves or our people too thin. And Alex is completely right. And it's something, again, that I've been going on about for years. And every conference that I speak at, every webinar, it's always about training. It's always about, we have got to get into schools and let people know we have an industry with careers for them. Children at school, if they're not particularly academic, they often get pushed down the building route, but they think that is bricklaying, plumbing or plastering. They don't get told about this large industry that we have with a whole other set of trades and skills that we can train people. We don't have great apprenticeship schemes set up for the insulation industry. They're very difficult because a lot of the stuff within the apprenticeships don't apply. So therefore you're having to try and create portfolios and be very loose with the training. Just to tick boxes, and I think it's such a large issue, and I'm a big fan of this social decarbonisation, the scheme, and the fact that it feels like we have some forward planning that we can do. We can start to make decisions, we can start to invest in our businesses because we're not working on a 12-month project here, a 2-year project there. We can see some consistency coming, so we can invest, and we can invest in our people. But we've got to have those people want to be invested in and want to be prepared to learn. And at the moment, I see it as the biggest risk of delivering at scale retrofit is simply not having the people to deliver it.
I completely agree, Danielle, and I would like to give an example of the fact that we did some training of passive house principles at the local college. So the idea is these were bricklayers, carpenters, electricians, all the sort of people that you would find on a build, and we spent a week or so going through all the different parts of how to build a passive house, because eventually, some form of passive house will be de rigueur on site. And it turned out from the discussions that we had with the lecturers and that at the college that nobody actually teaches anybody how to install insulation anywhere in a building. It's not a carpenter's course, it's not a bricklayer's course, although they might get shown how to put a bit of insulation in the walls. So we don't teach it. So then we kind of wonder why we're not very good at it sometimes. And it's not much of a mystery, really. If we don't teach it and it's not a core part of how to build a building is all about making it thermally efficient now. But it's not, the curriculums are 20 years out of date. It's bonkers.
Some of the supply organizations, the Saint-Gobains and so on, are doing that kind of training, but it's very much focused on their own products usually, right, rather than on general skills. I just wanted to pick up something Danielle said, which I completely agreed with about investment. I think one of the barriers to investment, both by organizations wanting to hire and train people and by the individuals themselves wanting to go in and invest in themselves by getting the training, is this endless two-year bites that the government programs give us. And we keep saying today, so does everyone, we need to do this on a much longer stride. We need to give industry the confidence to invest in people, invest in training, invest in equipment, invest in new strands of business. But they won't do that if it's going to disappear again after 2 years and then it's something different. Yes. And so getting consistency into the programs is going to be critical, I think.
Absolutely.
I think it was heartening from the Housing Association that we've been working with that there is an ambition to do some form of retrofit come hell or high water in terms of what government funding is available. And I think that's heartening for us as an industry that we now have a big enough client base that are just going to say, well, we don't really care what the government do or think or don't do and don't think. We're just going to plough on ahead. And if we can get some money out of the government on our journey, then all well and good. And I think that hopefully this is the start of hopefully the beginning of something decent in terms of trying to retrofit all the houses that we need to try and do over the next 10 to 20 years. And we haven't really got very long.
Well, I'm absolutely with you. I think good scale retrofit comes from ground up, and it's not just in housing where housing organizations are beginning to build zero carbon strategies up to 2050, and so they will indeed lever in whatever government money comes along when they can. But we've got to do the same thing with the owner occupiers. We've got to motivate them to want to get together, perhaps with their neighbours or with their family or whatever it is, and do retrofit on their homes. And it's got to be aspirational. It's got to be like a Mediterranean holiday or a new car or getting your kids into university or wherever it might be that drives families. We've got to make it that way. Otherwise, people won't do it. And
I do wonder if there's, in terms of the government, if it wanted to, and clearly the current government wouldn't want to interfere, but there is an opportunity that when houses come onto the market, that you could have like a separate operator that buys houses on the basis of that whilst they're a void, that's when you retrofit them and then puts them back on the market. And I mean, it would be a direct intervention, but you could potentially come up with a model that does that, because trying to live in a house whilst retrofitting it isn't a very pleasant experience.
Sure.
And very, very disruptive. And it'd be much better to do a whole house retrofit and take the whole thing apart if it was deemed suitable. So there could be different ways of delivering it to the private sector other than just relying on Mr. and Mrs. Smith to make that investment. But I get it that it needs to be aspirational, and I think you're going to see that with solar panels, battery storage and electric cars. They are aspirational items, and I think once people start putting those sort of things in, it then gets them to start asking other questions, and that's the start of the journey.
Yeah, I think we can see that very much. Go on, Daniel.
Yeah, at a ground level, we've seen the demand from the private sector absolutely rocket over the last year. And that's been twofold. The Green Homes Voucher Scheme, whilst many would deem it as a complete failure, because it did fail on a lot of elements, what it did do was raise the profile of insulation much higher in the public sector than it has been for many years. And also the cost of fuel. Heating your home has become something that almost feels aspirational, and therefore we're seeing people say rather than spend stupid money paying their bills, they'll invest on an average size solar system and obviously cavity wall insulation or whatever it may be to see their money on their house as opposed to going straight to an energy supplier. And we are seeing such a shift in the types of calls we're receiving, the types of inquiries we're receiving, and that has been led by both of those things, both the Green Homes voucher and now the cost of living crisis. I think we need to. I don't always know that it's government's place to subsidise these measures. I like it when they do from an installer point of view, but is it a long-term strategy? I don't know. But I do think something needs to be done to make it easier for people to afford it, whether that is via financing options, whatever it may be. There needs to be something to not only incentivise, but to make it affordable for people, green loans, whatever it is. Because people do want to improve their properties, the general feedback we get, just some can't afford to, and some have to make a choice as to how they spend what disposable income they have, and they don't necessarily have enough to do the whole package. And that's certainly the big difference with the private sector to the public is whole home retrofit does not exist in the public sector, the private sector, sorry, unless so a homeowner will not do a whole home retrofit unless they're doing a full renovation of their property. It's always the light touch stuff. No one's going to be looking at air tightness, at underfloor insulation, at all of those other things that really make a property fully retrofitted, because it's not cost effective, and they'll never make that money back on their fuel bills if they happen to spend £50,000-60,000 up front. So we've got to incentivise it, we've got to make it easier, and we've got to try and drive the cost down, which hopefully will come because we're working at scale through the social housing stuff.
I think the other avenue that, sorry, Peter, just jump in, Danielle, I completely agree with you, but one of the other avenues which I think is coming, and Peter, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I'm getting the feedback from some of my clients that I've dealt with over the last couple of years that mortgage companies are looking at their loan book, and they want a certain percentage of mortgages on A-rated homes and some on Bs, and ideally they're trying to make sure that Ds and Fs aren't on their loan book. And I'm not sure what the driver is in terms of, are they trying to show some sort of carbon credential, or they fear that those houses will be valueless in 25 years. But I've had several instances of houses, they simply can't buy them or sell them because nobody can get a mortgage on them, because in part the performance of the house. So could there be another driver that will encourage the private homeowner to retrofit their houses simply because it might be a mandatory part of getting a mortgage?
I mean, that's actually driven by government, who have been putting a lot of pressure on the financial organisations that do the loaning to do what they call greening their books. Right. And those requirements are coming from the financial regulators from the government via the financial regulators. So that's part of what I see as sticks and carrots that we need. The battle, I think, at the moment is to get the green finance organisations to adhere to the same standards that everybody else does. So, for example, PAS 2035 or the Passive House Standard or whatever, so that we get the work done properly. And there's a very good model in Germany with the DFW bank scheme, where central government puts money in at the top of the system into the bank, which loans money to people to do work on their homes. But you only get it at standard interest rate unless you conform to all the current standards for high quality retrofit, high performance, and achieve the performance targets. And you get it signed off by an accredited energy consultant, which would be like the equivalent of our retrofit coordinators. And once it's signed off, you become eligible for the lower interest rate. So suddenly your loan goes down by 2.5–3%. Your interest rate goes down. And that's been hugely successful in Germany in promoting improvements to homes that are of good energy quality. So I think that's a lesson for us. The sticks and carrots thing is interesting. The group at the Environmental Change Institute at Oxford University have done some very good work on the idea of having like minimum energy efficiency standards for private sector, but having them at say 4 or 5 year intervals, ratcheting up.
Okay.
So, for instance, your house, if you sell it in 2025, has to be at least a C, and then in 2030 it has to be at least a B, and so on. We may have to subdivide the bands of it, and it gets to sort of an A by 2040 or something of that kind. And those are standards that are published in advance that you can't sell unless you meet them.
Yep.
And what that means is that it will make the market price in the retrofit.
Yeah.
Because people aren't going to buy a house that's a D if they know it's got to be a B in 10 years' time, unless they put aside the 20 grand or whatever they need. So they're going to take that 20 grand off the price.
Yeah.
So the idea is to make the market price in the cost of improvement. And that would then go, that's the stick. And then the carrot would be to have these various grant schemes, low interest rates, subsidies to help people get there, particularly for those who are less able to pay.
Sure.
So I think all that stuff's out there. It's just not very coherently brought together. I mean, the one place it is coherently brought together, I think, is in the Construction Leadership Council's national retrofit strategy. But I went to a workshop at Bayes about a month ago, which was called the Delivery Summit for the National Retrofit Strategy. And when it was an invitation-only event, and I kind of thought, oh, this sounds good. We're going to have some action after all. And of course, you go along, and it's the same 30 people that have been to the last 4 similar events, still all asking for a retrofit hub, and not a single politician or senior member of Bayes showed up. It was just the secretariats for the Green Construction Board and the Construction Leadership Council who happened to be housed at Bayes. So it was very disappointing in that respect. But that there in that strategy is actually a coherent strategy which sets out in quite a lot of detail exactly what we need to do to make it all happen. And it's covered it covers a lot of the ground we've talked about in this conversation today.
So fun question, just going off a complete tangent. Who is the housing minister?
I haven't a clue. Does anybody know?
No idea. Do we have a housing minister? We don't have a prime minister, so why should we have a housing minister?
Well, the housing minister is the one that's changed the most in the last 20 years, if I remember rightly.
Yes, I think
there have been more housing ministers than any other type of minister, which suggests that it's a poison chalice of some kind that they don't want to pick up if they can avoid it.
Richard Bacon MP is MP for South Norfolk, so not that far from me, and he's been banging on about sort of self-building and trying to increase the supply of houses. And I do love, he does a presentation where he puts up slides of each political party's manifesto. And so you have the Conservatives were talking about 300,000 houses a year. The Lib Dems probably a bigger number because they can't count either. And then the Diane Abbott number from the Labour Party of about 1 million homes a year. And he changes one word on these manifesto statements, and he changes the word houses to tractors. And it says, the Conservative Party will aim to build 300,000 tractors. And of course, as soon as it just becomes laughable. And it just makes the point that actually any kind of centrally driven number is a meaningless, as building tractors. It's pointless, and that's not how it's going to work. And I do love that slide. It's a brilliant little presentation he does.
Sounds brilliant. I mean, it does. I do think it exposes there's a real contradiction in government policy, because one of the main planks of their strategy is to build as many houses as possible using those kind of simplistic measures. And at the same time, we're trying to get them to build those houses better so we don't have to retrofit them before 2050.
Yep.
And the house building industry is a very strong lobby. And as soon as you say to them, you should be building these houses to zero carbon because we don't want them to add to the burden of retrofit, and we don't want to have to do retrofit on them in the next 28 years, they say, well, if you make them build as better, we won't build as many, and it's going to be much more difficult. And so the housing target goes out the window. And the Tories have got to sort themselves out on this. Either they want to build houses, good houses, or they just want to build any old house. And at the moment, they're building any old houses, and there are far too many house builders building stuff that we will have, they're minimum building regs houses that we will have to retrofit. And we don't want another million to do. It's one every 5. It's 5 a minute as it is. So it's 5 a minute for the next 20 years as it is, without dealing with the new ones as well.
I think it's all about land price. So if the big boys knew over the next 20 years that they had to do zero carbon homes, that would get factored into the land price eventually. It's the way that, I mean, we call them house builders. They're not. They're financial institutions that sub stuff out. Yet they don't actually build anything.
I agree. I mean, actually,
and once you see them as a financial organisation, then it just comes down to the money, and it's about land bank values and all that kind of clever stuff that's way beyond my pay scale.
yeah, well, they make their money out of the increment in the value of the land when they develop it, and they buy it early and sit on it for years and all that kind of. Actually, you're right. They never have anyone on site.
No.
It's everything, including the site manager, or the on the site, is subbed out.
Yeah.
They have no interest in the quality of the product because they can sell anything they build.
Yes.
So they can throw anything up, be as cavalier about complying with the building regulations as they like, and they will sell it. And so why have they any interest in make it better? What we've got to do is decouple that, somehow deal with the land issue, and then make it necessary for them to build good quality products, because if they don't, they won't sell them. And then we could force them into taking an interest in doing things properly. But we're way miles from that, and they're such powerful organizations.
Yes.
Very difficult indeed, I think.
So what we need to do then as an industry, we just need to pay more to the politicians.
Doesn't feel quite right to me, that, Alex.
I completely agree, but I'm just sort of being slightly disingenuous. I think for me, being involved with Retrofit over the last few years has been a fascinating journey, and I thoroughly have enjoyed being involved with Retrofit. It's just frustrating a lot of the time in terms of which direction you look at. There's issues about, have we got the right labour? Have we got the right skills? Have we got the right materials? Have we got the right design? Have we got the right client? Have we got the right pots of money? And it doesn't seem to be a very easy process. And I guess, changing governments and, changing housing ministers on a weekly basis, having any kind of consistency that the industry can work to over the next 20 years seems to be beyond all our abilities. And it's not really that difficult, which I think is why I find it so frustrating to be involved with sometimes.
Yeah, I think we need to get cross-party consensus because governments only last 5 years or so, and then there's an election. That's the limit of their foresight and the limit of their commitment and future investment. But if we could get cross-party consensus on a strategy that everybody was signed up to, we might have some chance of getting the investment we need and the training we need and all those kinds of things.
Right, I'm sorry, but we got to stop it there. I'm sure you'll join me for the next episode where we can hear some more views from our guests.